Her talk today is based upon 5+ years of extensive research. Her talk will highlight key women, men, and groups who transported enslaved people from bondage to freedom and explore black whalemen in New England's maritime industry and how they persevered and retained pivotal career positions in order to assist the enslaved in their dash for freedom. Anna speaks to cultural and community groups in New England, Chicago, and elsewhere on the history of black whalemen, influential women in America, and the abolition movement. A professional collage and watercolor artist, she also teaches art to adults and children throughout Chicagoland and has curated shows for the Oakland Museum of Contemporary Art, the Kentwood Community, and Monarchy and Friends. Please welcome Deena. And please, if I haven't said this already, turn off your cell phones to silent, please, because we are videotaping this, and this will be up on our website eventually. Here you go. We'll do questions later.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful day, this special day when we honor moms everywhere. Yay, moms! As Sue said, I'm a watercolor and collage artist. I've been in my studio since 2002 producing original works of art. And then I became a researcher, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. First, I want to let you know that some of the history, some of the Underground Railroad history you'll hear today is sad. That's part of the history. But I also want to let you know that I'm not going to ply our minds and hearts with horrific images. Instead, the history that I'll share with you today is the history of people helping people. About 7 years ago, I discovered that in the 16 to 1800s, there were black men, free black men and enslaved black men, who were professional mariners. These men were working in the whaling industry and working on merchant ships. 25% of the black men who were brought here from Africa were already had mariner skills. Now, I never heard that in school. The only thing I ever heard was that black people were working in the fields, picking cotton, and working in households as domestics. Many colonists who lived by the deep waters of the East Coast hunted whales for their oil and their whalebone. They became so proficient at this that the United States became the #1 producer of whale oil and whalebone. Let me show you this. This is the wharf of a whaling port. After whale ships have come back, and you see hundreds, even thousands of barrels of oil. Black men involved in whaling helped bring economic stability and wealth to a fledgling nation. As an artist, I wanted to depict these black men, white men, and Native American men, all working together on these ships. So I traveled to the former whaling ports in New Bedford and Nantucket, Massachusetts. So as I'm going through the archives, I discover that not only were these black men involved in whaling, they were involved in 2 other important activities. They were involved in abolition and the Underground Railroad. These black men were called blackjacks. This is a historical account of black men involved in whaling and involved in the merchant industry. And it also gives historical details about how they were working as abolitionists and they were working with the Underground Railroad. Today, we'll hear the account of 3 persons who escaped bondage. But first, let me introduce you to William Still. William Still, known as the father of the Underground Railroad. During the 17th through 19th centuries, when groups had a cause, they formed a society. In December 1852, abolitionists who were already members of the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society created a vigilance committee. The mission of the vigilance committee was to raise funds and assist every freedom seeker that came their way. Not just some, but every freedom seeker that asked for their help. William Still was the secretary of the Vigilance Committee. Mr. Still kept records of the monies expended for supplies, and very importantly, Mr. Still kept a record of the final destination of every freedom seeker and what they had changed their name to. And the reason for that was that when other freedom seekers escaped at a later point, they would be able to reunite with their loved ones. The first account is about a young woman named Clarissa Davis. I don't have an image of her, but Clarissa was here in Portsmouth, Virginia, and she was trying to get to a free area in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Clarissa Davis fled Portsmouth, Virginia in May 1854 with two of her brothers. Her brothers made it to the ship, but Clarissa didn't make it. So Clarissa sought a hiding place. This hiding place where she was for 75 days had very little light and very little breathable air. But she hung in there, not wanting to be returned to slavery. Then one day, word was conveyed to her that the ship, the city of Richmond, had arrived in Philadelphia, and that the steward had agreed to secret her on this ship, if she could make it to the ship by the next day when the ship was to leave the port. During the 1600s and 1800s, the steward on whaling ships and merchant ships was often a black man. Clarissa Davis prayed all day that it would rain right hard to drive the police off of the streets. By midnight, there was no rain. She didn't give up. She kept praying. At 3 a.m., it began to rain, and it came down in torrents. Clarissa, dressed in male clothing, made it to that ship unmolested. And by William Bagnall, the steward, whose wife was enslaved, he was able to hide her away. And when the ship arrived in Philadelphia, he delivered her to William Still. Because of William Still's record keeping, Clarissa Davis was reunited with her brothers and her father, who had escaped earlier. She later wrote to William Still that she had changed her name to Mary D. Armstead. The next account is William Henry Johnson. William Henry Johnson was born into slavery in 1811. Mr. Johnson was trained as a jockey, and it seems that he was a natural with horses, as he won many purses for the slaveholder. One purse that he won was $50,000. In today's money, that's about $1.5 million. The slaveholder gave him $250. which today is about $7,000. Fearing that he might be sold to satisfy the slaveholders' gambling debts, Johnson escaped from slavery in 1833, about 22 years old, with the slaveholder daughter's help. And that happened a lot. Johnson used his earnings to book passage for himself and his mother on a coastal schooner. Now, a coastal schooner is not a passenger boat. So that tells you that somebody, the captain or a mariner, could have been a white captain, a black captain, a white mariner, a black mariner, or a Native American mariner. Somebody stowed them away on that boat. So another example of mariners working with the Underground Railroad. So they made it to New York, him and his mom, and then they moved to New Bedford, which was a virtual haven, safe haven, for formerly enslaved people. While doing work, janitorial work, in Timothy Coffin's law office, William Johnson taught himself to read and write using law books. Then he began to study law, and in 1842, at age 31, William qualified for the Massachusetts bar. He became the first African American who was eligible to practice law in the United States. He was also an anti-slavery lecturer, traveling on the anti-slavery lecture circuit. After the Civil War ended, William Johnson practiced law openly and was affectionately known as Squire Johnson. For decades, operatives of the Underground Railroad had developed a system that moved people from a boat to a stagecoach to a rail car and on and on. This is what you're seeing here, and this is how he and his mom escaped, moving from one form of transportation to another form of transportation until they reached a free state. Henry Brown. Henry Brown was born into slavery in Virginia around 1815. He worked on a plantation and later worked in the slaveholders' tobacco factory with about 150 other colored people. The slaveholder sold Henry's pregnant wife, Nancy, and their 3 children. This brought on Henry Brown's resolve to escape from bondage. Henry paid a friend $169 to ship a crate from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia. Henry was hiding inside. The crate was about 3 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet. It was marked this side up. And despite the markings, he was tumbled and tossed while being transferred from wagon to railroad to steamboat to another wagon to a ferry and on and on. Finally, the express driver brought the black box to the office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. A member of the society, James Mackham, saw the box that the express driver had delivered. Mackham later wrote, "I entered the office, dreading that I should find the man inside dead. You can better imagine that I can describe my feelings when tapping on the box and calling out, 'All right?' The prompt reply came from within. 'All right, sir.' He said, 'I never felt happier in my life.'" As the image shows, William Still and others came into the room, And when Malcolm opened the box, up rose the finest looking man you ever saw in your life. Mr. Still later wrote, but he was about as wet as if he had come up out of the Delaware. Henry Brown recuperated at the home of James and Lucretia Mott. He was nicknamed Henry Box Brown. Mr. Brown joined the efforts to free enslaved people in America by lecturing on the abolition circuit, recounting his treatment as a slave and the details of his escape. So are we getting some ideas about the Underground Railroad, its operations, and the people who risked a lot to help others? The Underground Railroad wasn't just on the East Coast. They had routes all over. So I'm going to talk about routes that were here in the Midwest so that a lot of people came from Missouri because they were so close, came from Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky. They were able to come up using these Midwestern routes. This is Levi Coffin and his wife, Catherine Coffin. They were North Carolina Quakers who opposed slavery. So they moved. They moved to Newport, Indiana around 1820s, and they were there till about 1840s. It has been documented that not a single freedom seeker who reached the coffins failed to reach freedom. You know, some did. They tried. Slave hunters were after them, and they were to return to slavery. One source that I reviewed said that authorities knew what the coffins were doing, but they could never catch them. Freedom seekers arriving at the coffin's home had traveled hundreds of miles, maybe even 1,000 miles. They were footsore, they were hungry, they were ill, they were scantily clothed. So who prepared the meals? Who nursed them back to health? Who made sure they were sleeping on clean bed linens? In those days, men didn't do that kind of work. Research tells us that Catherine and her female associates performed these services. Also, not only did Catherine do these domestic kind of things, before she was even married, she was in the field. She was a foot soldier in the field helping freedom seekers. And this is from a large work of art, but I just focused in on Catherine, right there, leading someone to freedom. Now, let's come to Chicago. This is John Jones and his wife, Mary Jones. Mary Jones and John Jones were central figures in the abolition movement here in Chicago. Their home at 9th and South Plymouth Port was used as a station on the Underground Railroad. Documents still exist that tell us that Mary would stand guard at the entrance of their home, while John and other Underground Railroad activists held meetings there. This is LCP Freer. John and Mary worked closely with LCP Freer and his wife Esther in these clandestine activities. The two couples worked closely with the Underground Railroad, but they were also close friends, often dining at each other's home. This time in America, that was rare. And even now, there is a visual reminder of their friendship, as their graves are not far apart, right here, that's Freer's stone. Their graves are not far apart at Graceland Cemetery, right here on Irving Park. I want to tell you about 3 others. Philo and Ann Carpenter. Philo Carpenter opened the first drugstore in the Chicago area. Both the drugstore and their home served as places of refuge for freedom seekers. Sources note that they helped about 200 freedom seekers find their way to Canada. Anne was deeply involved in assisting freedom seekers, and several accounts reflect her decision to provide help even when Philo was not available. Sylvester and Eliza Lind. Sylvester Lind was a lumber baron who placed freedom seekers on his ships, hiding under the lumber, I imagine. They were brought north to the mills, where other ships would take them to Detroit and into Canada. Alan and Joan Pinkerton. Alan Pinkerton, the renowned detective, was intimately involved in all aspects of the Chicago Underground Railroad activity. This is the same Alan Pinkerton that you hear appear sometimes on the Charlie Chan series. L.C.P. Freer, that we talked about earlier, in an interview late in his life, noted, "It was as hunter of slave hunters that I first knew Alan Pinkerton. And in hunting slaves to set them free, he first developed his remarkable powers as a detective." And now for our Mother's Day tribute. Let's go back to the East Coast. This is the distance between Boston and New Bedford. It's about 100 miles, which at that time, that's days travel, right? Days. So this is the area we'll be talking about. The first woman we'll talk about is Polly Johnson. New Bedford's Daniel Ricketson recalled that Polly Johnson was a mulatto woman, always ladylike and pleasant. He remembers seeing her walking arm in arm with Maria Weston. We'll talk about her a little bit later. Polly Johnson earned a living as a baker and a confectioner who would freeze her best ice and ice her best cakes for New Bedford's wealthiest citizens. Yum. She was committed to assisting those in bondage and often attended anti-slavery meetings. When Frederick Douglass escaped bondage and made it to New Bedford, Massachusetts, the first to give him shelter was Polly Johnson and her husband, Nathan Johnson. The home of Polly and Nathan Johnson have been restored. I've seen it myself, I was there. It's on the Historic Register and now houses the New Bedford Historical Society. I don't have an image of the next lady, but I want to talk about Esther Moore. For many years, no woman living in Philadelphia was better known to the colored people living in that city than Esther Moore. No woman, white or colored, left her home as often as Esther Moore, seeking out and aiding weary travelers. This philanthropist begged of the Vigilance Committee to let her know when every freedom seeker was in town. And if they didn't tell her, she was actually hurt. And when it was time for the freedom seeker to move to the next station, she would put a gold dollar in each person's hand. She also provided for the Underground Railroad in her will. Miss Moore said that the slavery prison house was a monster to be loathed by man and God. This is Abigail Goodwin. Abigail lived in Salem, New Jersey, about 44 miles from Philadelphia, where her friend Esther Moore lived. And just as Esther's home was a station on the Underground Railroad, Abby Goodwin's home was also a station. Abigail used so much of her financial resources to assist freedom seekers that her sister once said, "Few people come to our home whose clothes are as worn and patched up as Abby's." The Underground Railroad book, let me show you this one. This is William Still's book, The Underground Railroad, and this is just one of the books. Underground Railroad book contains 5 letters, correspondence between Abby and other women with the Underground Railroad. Evidence that these women were constantly sewing and patching and finding money to purchase hosiery for the colder weather of the North. Another letter tells us that abolitionists would not purchase slaves because they didn't want to put money in the slaveholders' hands. However, Esther, Abby, and some others made an exception and pooled money together to purchase a family because the price was so low, $1,000 for 10 people. A slaveholder would get that for 1 person. And because they wanted to keep this family of 10, of adults, children, and older members together, they wanted to keep them from being separated. The last women on the East Coast that I'll talk about. There were 4 Weston sisters. This is Maria Weston and Deborah Weston. And you probably recognize William Lloyd Garrison. At a time when women were expected to remain at home, the Weston sisters left home to work in the cause of ending slavery and assist freedom seekers. The Weston sisters, Maria, Caroline, Ann, and Deborah, were all players in the abolition movement. They were part of the so-called Boston clique of abolitionists. All 4 sisters were founding members of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. The Westons, like Garrison and many others, were calling for an immediate end to slavery, while others in this nation thought they wanted slavery to end, but they thought it could take place over a number of years. In 1835, Ann and Deborah were staying in New Bedford, and they initiated a massive petition drive. Ann wrote to her sister, Maria, that collecting signatures for the petition drive in New Bedford should be easy because Burdett Washington, a formerly enslaved person, had just told his story the day before. Burdett Washington told his story. Many tears were shed. And then a collection of $102, which that's about $3,000 today, was taken up, and 2 rings. Can you imagine people being so moved by an enslaved person's story that they took the rings off their finger and put it into the ground? A year later, in 1836, the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society began a petition campaign conducted with other anti-slavery organizations in the North. Ann Weston oversaw the distribution and collection of these petitions in every ward in Boston and in every town in the entire state of Massachusetts. Well, that wasn't too difficult, right? I mean, she probably just used the internet. I want to ask one question before I end. So what was the purpose of these petitions that they were collecting? They were collecting signatures. What was the purpose of these petitions, and where were these petitions going? Does anybody know?
Congress?
Congress, yeah.
They were going to Congress, yes. These petitions were going to Congress. You know, people didn't wake up one day and say, what should we do today in Congress? Oh, maybe we'll end slavery. John Quincy Adams, who was serving in Congress during this time, in one of his books, he says that Congress received over 100,000 petitions demanding that slavery end. And it was primarily women who collected the signatures. The men were out earning a living. It was primarily women who got this done. So I'd like to summarize today and say that in my research, I am always amazed at how many people of various backgrounds were willing to help freedom seekers who just wanted to earn a living and live a decent life. There was a time in America when almost everyone we studied in American history was male. Is it wonderful that we are now more and more including the important role that women played in American history? The women we've studied today, and many others, and men, put forth a lifelong effort to assist, to end slavery and to assist freedom seekers. And I truly enjoyed sharing this with you. I truly enjoyed sharing these historical accounts of the Underground Railroad and ending on Mother's Day with stories of some of these courageous, awesome women.
Questions, if you've got questions of our speaker?
Yes.
Congress was getting these petitions in the 30s, you said. Did they ever get involved in debating that and considering it before we just think of Lincoln freeing the slaves? We don't really know what happened well before that.
Right.
John Quincy Adams was involved in it.
Oh, John Quincy Adams was in the center of it. Yes, they received all these petitions. They have been receiving petitions since the early 1800s. At one point, they had received so many petitions, and of course there were so many people against ending slavery, both from the North and the South, because they had business connected with the South. They had received so many petitions that they had decided, well, what should we do? We can't, there's too much arguing back and forth. So they decided that they would table the petitions. They would log them in, but they would never get to them. John Quincy Adams was responsible for getting those petitions off the table and up for discussion.
A couple of questions. A quick one, what is his name? Henry Box
something or other?
Did he
Yes.
find his family? That's the first question. Wasn't he the one who was trying to get back with his wife? Was there any notation about that?
You know what, I don't think he ever found his family, I never read anything. His pregnant wife was sold, and their 3 children.
Okay.
And he was in, excuse me, in Virginia. Quite often, they were selling slaves to the deeper South, because that's where the demand was. Cotton was becoming king. And usually, once a person's family was sold to the South, they never saw him again.
The other question is, what were the repercussions for people up in the north, like in New Bedford and such? If people, number one, found them housing slaves or helping it, or number two, just knowing that they do it but not catching them? Were there legal repercussions or local social repercussions?
There were both social repercussions and legal. And I thought I'd have a shorter time today, so I omitted some of the stories. But the legal repercussions were always severe because they wanted to discourage people. People were hung, people's hands were stamped, you know, like you do a horse, branded.
Is that
with
even in the north? Even
Yes.
in the north?
Yes, they were branded slave stealer. Another one, he tried to bring a family north, and he got as far as the border of Indiana. Someone turned him in for the money, and they found him at the bottom of the river. I guess he floated up. He had weights wrapped around his ankles. So the punishment was always severe. Someone else I talked about last time spent 4 years in prison.
For helping the slave?
Yes, and that was hard labor. By the time he was released, he was kind of mentally debilitated and physically debilitated, and he ended up committing suicide.
Margaret?
Yeah, it was grand theft, because the worth of a slave was high enough that if you stole a slave, which is how
The Runaway Slave Act was,
yeah.
Yes.
Scott?
Well, these slaves were not free until they got to Canada, as I understand.
Well, they were.
Because the British Empire abolished slavery, I think, in 1832. Did
Well,
you do any research of the final welcoming or the final progression that got them out of our country into Canada?
Well, they were free once they reached a free state. But the problem was that even though they were in a free state, a slave hunter could come into that state with paperwork and take them back.
That's what I mean, because of the Fugitive Slave Act.
That's right.
Criminalized their being in a free state if they were caught.
You're right, you're right. And that's why they were always asked, do you want to stay here? This is a nice place. And a lot of them said, oh no, I'm going on to Canada. I don't even feel safe here.
Rochelle?
Were there any instances of slave catchers going into Canada and forcibly bringing slaves back to the United States?
They could not go into Canada. They could come into the states in the north that were free, but they could not go into Canada. Canada wasn't having it. Anyone who was in Canada was free.
I have read, and I'm sure others have too, that it wasn't just escaped slaves that were vulnerable. Even free blacks in the North were vulnerable. I remember reading something about Lincoln, that there was a woman who worked for the Lincolns who was free. But she was always vulnerable because the slave catchers weren't all that, shall we say, careful about who was and was not subject to capture.
And that was especially true with the passing of the second fugitive slave law in 1850. And that law made it just like an open season, like just carte blanche. And people coming from the South, you know, they had come a long way, they had expenses. They were only going to be paid if they brought slaves back. So they were taking anybody.
Right.
They were snatching people off the street. And these people had no rights. Black people at that time had no rights in court. they couldn't even speak in a court of law. And that's why so many people felt vulnerable even if they were free.
Even if they were free.
Yes.
Mitch?
I've heard it said that Evanston was one of the specific stops on the Underground Railway. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I don't have information specifically on Evanston, but I know that the information is available. I haven't been able to research that information yet, but I'm sure that you're right. Evanston and the suburban areas north of us, they were all, there was somebody in that area, more than likely, that was involved in the Underground Railroad. It was up and running in the Chicago area and in the state of Illinois by the 1840s. The Underground Railroad in Illinois was in full swing.
Chris?
I guess I had a similar question. If anybody ventures out into DuPage County, you might see that they have various markers in Hinsdale and Oak Brook, talking about how, like by Growl Mill, for example, which is a historic site, they talk about that as being an Underground Railroad site. And I just wondered if you were familiar with that.
There's someone who's going to publish a book soon, and Larry McClellan, and he has all of that information, so I know that what you're saying is true. I took part in his tour, and he was touring us around Underground Railroad stations that are in the south suburbs.
Okay.
And it's amazing just how organized it was out there. Matter of fact, we know the street Dalton around 140th, if you're going on 94, that man was involved in the Underground Railroad. That's why that stop is named after him.
You described the abolitionist groups as if they were fairly active up north. Was it feasible for any such group to exist in the South? Did they openly, you know, I mean, it's a little bit like here, we think of anti-war movements were able to function in some regards. But was that feasible in the South, or was that?
I would say absolutely not.
So it had to be all secretive.
It had to be somewhat secretive up here, but down there it was intolerable. The slaveholders, you know, they had a militia that, and men between, I think, age 25 and 55 had to volunteer and work in the militia. Everybody had a turn. Let's say they had a monthly calendar. Everybody had a turn, and at night they rode horses and they patrolled the grounds. And as far as, you know, someone working there, that's why the coffins had to move. And I don't know if you know about the Grimke sisters.
That's what it
Mhm.
was. South Carolina?
But yes, they had to move. People that were against slavery, it was just intolerable there. They'd have to move. So I don't think there could have been any anti-slavery organizations functioning in the South.
Lisa?
But do you want to tell the story that you were telling me about Harriet Tubman freeing the 700 from one plantation?
Oh, yes. And we've all heard of Harriet Tubman. So someone sent me, maybe it was you, sent me a really nice video. You know, she has at least 2 museums now on the East Coast. So we know her as a conductor, but she was also a spy. And during the time when she was living, there were a lot of spies on plantations, because this is how word was getting around. You know, no phones, no internet, nothing. Word was getting around by word of mouth. Now, she was considered one of the best spies in the country. So, someone wanted to free, what was it, about 700 slaves from various plantations in the same area. Well, there had to be word delivered of what was going to happen when these people armed with weapons were going to come down and get this plan done. Well, how would they know? The people that were going to be involved. Someone would have to go and tell them. And most men and women that wanted to help freedom seekers, they were saying, oh, we'll help them. If they can get right here, up here, by the border. Very few people who were free wanted to go into the deep south. But Harriet Tubman did. And on one occasion, because of the word that she delivered, 700 slaves were freed in one night.
Marty?
Oh, in a place like New Bedford, up in the north area, can you say on average about how far these various houses were where slaves would be housed or?
No, I can't say how far they were, but what I'll say is that they traveled at night. They obviously could not travel by day. And of course, they were not traveling on regular roads. These people were going through the woods at night. They were traveling through, the conductors that were leading the groups would know where the shallowest point in the river is. So that, they wouldn't have to swim, so that they could walk across. They had people, professional rowers, enslaved people that would come out at night and row groups across the river. So it was all done at night, and there's just no telling how far these people had to travel without shoes, hungry, without clothing, to make it from one station to another. There were also stations that were not homes. It would just be a carriage that was a rickety looking carriage that looked like it had been abandoned. It was turned upside down and it was just shoved into a hillside. But the conductor knew where that station was and would get people there at night and tell them, wait, and in a day or two, someone will come for you. And they'll say this, so that they know not to come out just if they hear horses, but they will come and they will say this.
Anybody else have any questions?
I thought there was one more.
Oh,
Uh-huh.
I'm at the risk of monopolizing. I guess I have two. I'm curious what, if anything, you have to say about Colson Whitehead's book, The Underground Railroad. Did he pick up on things in particular that resonated with what you have learned about?
I tried to read his book, but I'll tell you the truth, I couldn't read it. Because I've done the research and I know the historical facts, I started trying to read it and I just couldn't read it.
Okay. And then the other thing I just was curious about is I know the Pinkerton Detective Agency as an anti-labor group, like they've supplied strikebreakers or cracked down on labor unions in the 1880s.
Yes.
So I was kind of surprised to see them mentioned as being sympathetic to what we would have known or as fugitive slaves when I was a kid in history class. So I'm just curious, was that just a personal sympathy that he had, do you think? Or
not just only a personal sympathy, that's how he started. That's how his career began.
as helping slaves or helping catch slaves?
He was hunting, as LCP Freer said, he was hunting slave hunters.
Okay.
To free the slaves.
Okay.
And he developed a lot of his detective knowledge and skills and the things that he learned to do as a detective. They were developed in his hunting slaves to set them free. That was the beginning of his detective career.
Okay, and that seems antithetical to, or contrary to him helping break unions 20, 30 years later. So I don't know, I mean, that's what I learned, but.
I thought the slave hunters were doing something that was illegal. He was hunting them because they were doing something that was illegal?
No, he was just hunting them because he was against slavery. He was hunting them. In other words, he was following them to set the people free
But
that they were taking back.
But they had
to
the
South.
protection of law, right?
That's right.
They had the protection of the law. Yes.
So how did he manage to get them? They had the protection of law, whereas he didn't, but he was able to prevail.
Had more guns.
Maybe that's it.
He had more smarts.
Right.
He outwitted him.
Uh-huh.
Okay, Rochelle and then Marnie and Rochelle?
Yeah, yeah. When the spies went into the 7 states to spread the word, were there any instances of them being betrayed by some of the black slaves?
People were betrayed by everybody. There were enslaved people who betrayed enslaved people. They got word that there were going to be people trying to leave tonight, and they would tell the slaveholder. So there was all kinds of betrayals going on.
When you say hunting the slave hunters, do you mean that they were killed? And that's what Pinkerton did? He killed them?
I haven't read that he killed them, but what I read is that he used his knowledge as a detective. He developed these maneuvers to get the slaves away from the slave hunters. That's what I read so far. As you keep researching, read different things, you read more and more.
It's probably all.
Yes.
All of that too.
All right.
There's this,
Alice?
Alice, at
Uh-huh.
his gravesite in Graceland Cemetery, there's a marker that mentions that he and his wife played a role in the Underground Railroad. And
Pinkerton?
Pinkerton, yes, and one of the other things for which he is known is helping Abraham Lincoln reach Washington safely for his first inaugural. There were many rumors that the South, which had already, if you remember, this would have been early March of 1861, and the secessionists had already, states had already seceded from the Union. It was very clear that there was going to be a war. It was just a matter of time, and there were rumors about Lincoln being kidnapped or killed, kidnapped in order to forestall war, in order to negotiate for peace. And Pinkerton helped basically smuggle Lincoln into Washington, D.C.
Is he disguised as a woman?
That's one story, and I don't know if that's about.
That would have been a good
Would have been a very tall woman.
Yeah, very tall.
It's a little hard to believe.
I had also heard that Pinkerton Federal Agency played a significant role in investigating the assassination of Lincoln.
Yeah, I think I've heard that as well.
Yeah.
Okay, we want to have a little time to socialize and things. I'm going to bring Ken up for announcements. This is Ken.
Thanks, Deanna. So after the break,